George Galloway, and the mother of all talk shows. Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway.
Have you seen Oppenheimer, you masters of war? Mr. Rutte handing over F-16s to Zelensky in a losing war, which might very well turn the tide all right. The tide between conventional and a nuclear confrontation between the superpowers. The Russian army is advancing unstoppably towards Kupiansk. The Ukrainian army fleeing has blown up the bridge over the river as they fled. Kupiansk is about to change hands for the 5th time in 100 years. I hope you're ready to die and see all around you destroyed forevermore. Over which side of a line Kupiansk should lie on in the map. And one PeterWilby will be attracting my attention for a few minutes at least, for that is all he deserves. But he does deserve that for reasons you'll swiftly grasp just as soon as I have finished talking. And we'll be speaking about satraps. You thought Britain was the ultimate cuck, the ultimate satrap of the United States empire. You haven't looked at Australia, once fair, I'm afraid, now foul. And we'll be talking about the latest of our alumni to appear before the Security Council of the United Nations. 4 of our people have now been there. Danny Haiphong is the latest, and he will tell us all about it here on the mother of all talk shows. Fasten your seatbelts.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway, the mother of all talk shows. With George Galloway, the world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
The mass murderer of 7 little newly born children in England in a National Health Service hospital by an NHS nurse has captured the imagination and horrified the people of this country over the last 3 years. For that is how long this trial, this legal process has lasted. I say at least 7 because there is the possibility that this young woman, whose name I don't intend to mention, please excuse me, has killed hundreds, and maybe even more than hundreds. This young woman may be the greatest mass murderer in British history, because they are now investigating all of the newly born children who died, most of them entirely unexpectedly, whilst in hospitals in which she was an NHS nurse. There's not much more that I can say about her. The only question is, should we pay taxes to keep her, presumably under maximum security, for the rest of her life, which may be a very long time, in a maximum security jail? Or does this person deserve capital punishment? I myself am opposed to capital punishment, and I guess even in the teeth of this case, I remain so. But if ever there was a case for capital punishment for a mass murderer of newly born babies in maternity units, in labor wards, in the ICUs of English hospitals, it surely would belong to her. If ever there was a return of capital punishment. It's interesting to see what people think should be the kind of murder that warrants it. And we're running a poll right now. Should child murderers face the death penalty? It's an enormous response. Almost 20,000 people have voted already. Get your vote in. More importantly, in a way, is that a number of doctors warned the executives, the NHS managers, of these bizarre deaths that seem to occur every time this particular nurse was on shift. The motives of this woman can only be speculated on. Some of them are very dark indeed, but what were the motives of the managers in refusing to act when clinicians, doctors, told them they were suspicious of this young woman and did nothing about it? When will their heads roll, professionally speaking, metaphorically speaking? It's a big issue that hasn't yet had enough attention. Mind you, my next subject has had no attention at all, which is why I am forced to bring it to your attention. I first knew PeterWilby when he worked at the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, when he was the live-in lover, boyfriend of a then little-known man called PeterMandelson, now Lord Mandelson, bosom buddy of the late Jeffrey Epstein. Wilby was a relatively unassuming person. The peacock was PeterMandelson. But to my astonishment, Wilby, who had no journalistic training or background of any kind, went on to have a glittering career in journalism, from the Trade Union Congress to the editorship of the Independent on Sunday and the New Statesman. Why do I mention it? Not just because of his exotic connections, but because Wilby, the Independent newspaper, and above all the New Statesman, defined what it was to be left for decades in the British Labour, trade union, and socialist movement. If you weren't in with the in crowd, you were out in the out tray. I speak as one of the latter. If PeterWilby didn't give you his imprimatur as a pucka bona fide leftist, you were nobody, man. Don't even bother to show up at the ball. There's no ticket for you. And this period that we have lived through, where what's left became so grotesque that anybody who really was left the left, was somehow defined by these degenerates like PeterWilby, who was convicted on Friday of being in possession of and making use of real live video of the sexual assault of tiny children. I'm talking toddlers being raped. PeterWilby had downloaded these images, thousands of them, over decades. The same decades when he was lecturing us on whether we passed the litmus test of being leftists, left enough to be in his club. Thousands of images, many of them of the most serious kind, as the police describe them, which means live images of actual children being raped. Wilby admitted to the court that he had been viewing these images since the early 1990s. Now, I appreciate that while you will be as appalled as any right-thinking person will be at the news I have just imparted to you, and will be as amazed as I was that for this heinous crime, he received a suspended sentence. Like William Zanzinger, PeterWilby got a suspended sentence, even though if nobody watched this evil, the makers of the videos would not make them. A suspended sentence for this vile excrescence known as Wilby. The New Statesman's erstwhile editor, the Independent on Sundays, erstwhile editor, the policeman of political credentials, as was, won't serve a day in jail for the evil that he has committed. Now, I went to see Oppenheimer the other night. First of all, it is a masterpiece of a movie, and there's not much more I can say about it. Filmically, cinematically, it is simply unmissable. You cannot call yourself interested in contemporary and historical events, particularly the danger of world war and nuclear war, and not go to see Oppenheimer. It is a dazzlingly brilliant film, but I'll leave it to the arts and culture critics to analyze it more closely than that. My main point that I want to bring to your mind is that nobody who watched Oppenheimer could possibly support the continued escalation and ratcheting up of the confrontation between the United States and Russia. You would literally have to be insane. You'd have to be in Ward 5 in Broadmoor to view with equanimity the sight of Zelensky sitting in the cockpit in Amsterdam of an F-16 American fighter jet, nuclear capable. You would have to be insane to view with equanimity the boasting by Zelensky today with Rutte, the runt that runs the Netherlands for now, before he leaves politics entirely in just 8 weeks' time. His parting gift to the world is to make an escalation in the war that may very well be the opening of the final chapter of humanity. I'm not exaggerating, because, as someone once said, every shadow is a bird of prey to the small animal who falls underneath it. Every F-16 will be regarded, should be regarded by Russia as capable of nuclear attack on her. After all, you could hardly take a chance on that, could you? How do you know if it's a Storm missile only that is hurtling towards you? How do you know that cruise missile is not tipped with a nuclear warhead, which, if you don't respond, will be capable of annihilating your ability to respond? Do you see what I'm saying here? I pointed out to someone this very afternoon, down by the river, Finland to Russia is the width of that river. If you fire a missile from Finland towards Russia, who is going to hesitate over whether that missile is going to kill 500 or 500,000 of your fellow citizens. I want you to watch Oppenheimer. I want you to watch the detonation of the nuclear bomb that exploded first in Hiroshima and the second a few days later on Nagasaki. And I want you to think about this fact that every single nuclear weapon in the world today is 1,000 times more powerful than that one on the screen behind me. Not twice as powerful, 10 times or 100 times, but 1,000 times more powerful. Each one 1,000 times more powerful than that bomb, which annihilated in seconds 70,000 people like that, annihilated them, and then killed more slowly another 130,000 people after the radiation and the other effects of that bomb, 1,000th of the power of any single bomb in the armories of nuclear weapons states this day. It won't be 200,000 who die in London or who die in Leningrad, St. Petersburg. It will be millions. It will be everybody once the weapons start flying. So, of course, I'm cursing the masters of war here. But I'm also cursing you, the public of the United States, of the United Kingdom, of the Netherlands. Where are the mass demonstrations in the Netherlands at this criminal escalation that took place today? Nobody gives a toss. Nobody's watching Oppenheimer. Nobody has any idea or care about what the impact of these weapons will be. The end. Do you understand me? Capital letters. The end. Because, of course, once one flies, the others must ineluctably fly. You can't call a halt to a nuclear war. What are you going to say? Well, we've lost 17 million people and you've lost 17 million. Let's not fire anymore. It doesn't matter if you fire anymore, because the radiation will kill you all from the ones you've already fired. It doesn't matter if you're in a bunker. What are you going to emerge from that bunker into? What kind of world? What kind of nuclear winter? I was watching with my kids this afternoon a documentary on the dinosaurs. They say, might be right, might not be right, a meteor hit the earth and wiped out all the animals, wiped out all the dinosaurs that had been ruling the roost for millions of years. Think thousands of meteors landing on your cities. As you can tell, I'm highly exercised by this point. Not for myself. I'm old. I'm ready to meet my Maker. Not even for my own family, because we are religious believers. We believe that we will all be together again one day. But how can it possibly be other than a work of Satanism to willfully destroy everybody and everything for the sake of Kupiansk? Seriously? It's all coming up over the next 1 hour and 40 minutes. Fasten your seatbelt. It's going to be a bumpy night.
people today struggle with the common mainstream media consumer. These types of people are mindless zombies. Instead of living authentically, they feed off masking their true thoughts and feelings, doing nothing and criticizing those who actually do their research. These type of media consumer can be highly manipulative, so here are some golden standard clapbacks when they start with their propaganda. When they say you are too much for them, show them a mirror and tell them to look for less. Draw a diagram of where your business is and their business is, to visually show them they are in the wrong area. When they say, please watch this clip from this reputable BBC journalist, remind them that there are no longer any reputable BBC journalists, and to instead watch the mother of all talk shows for some real journalism. The next time you encounter a brainwashed zombie, hold your head high and know their obsession to eat your brain is masking their jealousy of your confidence, your freedom in self-expression, and most importantly, your authenticity. Keep listening to learn more on the mother of all talk shows.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
So I told you we've got a poll. Should child murderers face the death penalty? Yes or no? You can vote on my Telegram channel, t.me/George Galloway. You should be following me on Telegram anyway, because that's the last redoubt. And on X, as I'm being told, I must call it Twitter to older viewers. You can vote on my Twitter stream. You can vote on the YouTube community stream and on the YouTube community poll and on the YouTube stream. 18,522 of you have voted already. And pretty overwhelmingly, you believe that child murderers should face the death penalty. Rather surprising result there. Here are the phone numbers if you want to comment on what I've had to say. I understand there are an awful lot of comments already in on the chat. The number in the UK and Ireland, it's free of charge, is 08081965522. That's 08081965522. And in the US and Canada, again toll free, it's +1 844 944 3344. That's +1 844 944 3344. And in the rest of the world, it's 44203 966 2625. That's +44 203 966 2625. Now, the fourth guest lecturer at the Open University of the Airwaves, the mother of all talk shows, has just appeared before the United Nations Security Council. It's extraordinary how this university is making progress. He's a young man and a brilliant one too. Danny Haiphong joins us now. Danny, welcome, fresh from what I hope was a triumph. I haven't watched it yet, but I'm sure it was a triumphant appearance at the United Nations. Tell us what you said there and what they said back to you.
Well, thanks for having me back on, George. It's always a pleasure to be on your great program. So what I said during my briefing to the United Nations Security Council on the question of the dangers that Western armaments to Ukraine pose to global peace and stability was that the conflict in Ukraine is simply being escalated by the fact that the United States and NATO countries have committed so much militarily to Ukraine in complete contravention of the UN Charter, and in doing so have caused just a great deal of damage, not just to Ukraine, which is in the third month of this counteroffensive, which has seen over 43,000 Ukrainian forces killed, thousands of pieces of NATO armaments destroyed, but also to the United States, Europe and NATO itself. These countries are in free fall. there is an economic crisis across the world, and it's particularly hitting the U.S. and Europe quite hard. And the military situation for these countries is also pretty dire, considering the fact that now you have, and I cited the fact that there are officials that come straight from NATO, that come straight from these hawkish think tanks, that are all admitting that not only is Ukraine unable to win this conflict against Russia, but also NATO countries, including the United States, are suffering mightily in terms of their ability to supply the weapons that Ukraine supposedly needs to win. So in effect, this is a losing battle that the United States and NATO are engaged in, and that it is in the interest really of everyone to stop. And it's only Russia and China also that are calling for, as permanent members of the Security Council, a real negotiated settlement to this conflict. And that is the irony. In terms of the response, though, the UK delegate, the French delegate, they were the most flustered by my remarks. The UK delegate called me a fringe journalist, while the French delegate claimed that Russia was simply calling the meeting in order to spread its propaganda. Mind you, all of the delegates from the collective West, the US, the UK, France, and as well as you could call extensions of the collective West, such as Japan, they all couldn't stop promoting Cold War talking points against Russia, politicizing the conflict, politicizing the UN Security Council, and making it all about how Russia not only needs to stop its so-called invasion, but really how Russia needs to be destroyed. This is the way they talk about this conflict, and it just goes to show which side they really are on. They are on the side of permanent war.
It's a paradox, though, Danny. If you read the more serious of the newspapers, magazines, listen to the more serious commentators, they're all saying now that the war is all but lost. And yet the yellow press, which is for the consumption by the masses, continues to talk nonsense about Russia losing hand over fist and so on. And the politicians ride that particular horse rather than the one in the more serious papers. So on the principle that throwing good money after bad is a bad idea, even for a fool, and reinforcing failure is a well-known foolhardiness. How come we're still doing it? Why did the Netherlands up the ante today spectacularly by effectively handing over their Air Force and their F-16s to Zelensky?
Well, and this is despite the fact that those F-16s are probably not going to get off the ground for another year, given what the United States has admitted about the training that is necessary to make these operable on the battlefield. So the reason why the collective West cannot seem to get out of its own way here, and the reason why they're not listening to, I mean, the Pentagon said before the counteroffensive started, this probably isn't going to go well. The CIA admitted the same about the counteroffensive. And now you have articles coming out in the Washington Post today. You had a couple of days ago in Politico, all saying that the counteroffensive is not only lost, but maybe they should have listened. Maybe the Biden administration should have listened to Mark Milley, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when he said back in November of last year that perhaps there needs to be a negotiated settlement to this conflict because the future does not look bright for Ukraine. But the reason why these countries, why Europe, why this bloc of countries, these unipolarists, I would call them, the United States in the lead, continue to go down this path is because a conflict with Russia, a war with Russia, is really existential for the U.S. foreign policy establishment and the mega corporate forces, especially the military-industrial complex that control them. They see this as a conflict that must be fought at some level. And now they're just starting to understand that this whole notion that some kind of offensive is going to bring Russia down or take back territory is a moot point. But even their calls for so-called settlement or negotiation really just amounts to a freeze, or what NATO has tried to push to Ukraine, which Ukraine rejected wholesale, is NATO membership for Ukraine, while Ukraine cedes the fact that it's going to have to give up the territory that Russia has won. This is a non-starter for Ukraine, and not only this, but the only so-called peace settlement that the West really supports is a complete loss for Russia, is Russia's defeat. And that's just not going to happen. So there is this existential crisis for the collective West where they feel they need so badly to bring down Russia and what Russia represents as part of this rising multipolar world. But their means of doing it through a proxy war in Ukraine is just not working out. So it is quite the conundrum, and it's not one that they're going to be able to resolve lest they either admit defeat or they continue going down this path of destruction they've set for themselves.
Well, the heavyweight press talk in terms of a freezing of the conflict, of a Koreanization of the conflict, drawing a parallel somewhere, and neither war nor peace being the state of affairs thereafter. But why would Russia agree to freeze the conflict and allow those parts of the Ukraine that they have not yet taken to become, like South Korea, a super-armed NATO encampment? It's bad enough they're in Finland across the river. Why would the Russians agree to any such freezing of the conflict? As a matter of fact, every day that goes by, and I mentioned at the beginning of the show, there's a wholesale, described in the media I just read as unstoppable Russian advance towards Kupiansk this evening. Every day that goes by, the price of a negotiated settlement rises very steeply in terms of territory and other Russian demands, denazification, demilitarization, and so on. I don't see this ending in a Korean-style ending. I see it ending more in a Vietnam-style ending, with NATO clambering off the roof of the American embassy, trying to get a place on the last helicopter out of Kiev. What do you think?
Well, I think you're really onto something, George, because to be honest, the so-called Koreanization opportunity was lost after the Minsk Accords were completely and utterly trashed and destroyed by NATO itself, by the United States and NATO itself. It was they who used the Minsk Accords, who used this ceasefire agreement to build up Ukraine to the point of the time of the so-called invasion that Russia started. Throughout that period, throughout that 8-year period, it was the United States and NATO militarizing Ukraine, getting it ready, and also violating the accords at every step by continuing to shell and bomb and attack the Donbass. And that's why this conflict is currently at the stage that it's at. And so you bring up a really good point in conjunction with this, because not only does Russia have this experience of knowing what it's like to negotiate with the collective West and being burned by that. There's no trusting the collective West. But now you also have the fact that Russia is the one succeeding on the battlefield. Russia is the one that has the capabilities, that has the ability to continue to fight a war of attrition. It is not facing the severe shortages that the collective West is, and it is making headway on the battlefield. It has stopped this offensive. This Ukrainian offensive is all but defeated. So there is no reason for Russia to give any leverage to the collective West when it knows that doing so means that it's going to have to give concessions that it cannot allow to stand. It cannot allow Ukraine to be a part of NATO. It cannot allow Ukraine to be militarized in this way. The precedent had been set in 2014 during the coup, but really over the last 15, 20 years when NATO was encircling Russia. We can go back 30 plus years, encircling Russia, moving up to its border, and of course Ukraine being on Russia's border, that being the red line that sparked this entire conflict. So there really is no reason, as you said, George, to enter into peaceful negotiations without the goodwill and good faith of the collective West in giving concessions to Russia that it has been asking for from the beginning, that its security interests are respected. And there is no real hope for that. And I think Russia understands this. That's why Russia says very firmly, we're not going to be negotiating with Zelensky or the Ukrainian government. We're going to negotiate with its masters. And only when its masters in the collective West are able to begin to forward a position that allows for Russia's existence and its interests to be respected, just like international law really does put forth quite clearly that in times of conflict, there needs to be good faith and goodwill in any kind of maintenance of this peace and stability that we also seek. But that has not been the case since the very beginning. And all the naysayers out there always like to forget, and they always like to erase the fact that this conflict began in 2014 with the coup, and then with the thousands upon thousands of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers and people in the Donbass residing along Russia's border being attacked and terrorized by the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian regime backed by the US and NATO.
Let's, in the last few minutes, look at the slightly bigger picture. I was reading today not only the point that you made about these self-harming, even suicidal sanctions that the collective West has placed on Russia, which have turned out to be a gigantic boomerang, but the cementing of now an unbreakable relationship between Russia and China, the precise opposite of US foreign policy goal since 1972 and President Nixon's visit, the first communique, and so on. The point of American policy from 1972 onwards was to keep Russia and China as separate as possible. Now they have made this great leviathan of Russia-China. You can say it in almost as one word, Russia-China. They've made this gigantic leviathan, which will surely be the core of this Eurasian future of which we talk. It's a spectacular foreign policy blunder by the West, isn't it? And was there any sign at the United Nations that any of them even have begun to realize that?
No, not at all. Actually, the United States in particular, but really the collective West as a whole, is on this suicide mission to try to galvanize any country within the global South, within the sphere, Eurasian sphere, and also in Africa as well, in Latin America, any country it can, and try to organize them against Russia and China, as if that militarily is actually going to meet the objectives that the United States has set forth at the moment. The reality is that China and Russia, of course, have their own independent political and economic reasons for developing a strong relationship. The Cold War was a disaster in large part because those two countries were split politically and then, of course, economically. Now, the interesting thing that is occurring is that when the United States, when the collective West go after Russia and China simultaneously, what they are really admitting to is the fact that they can't break the bond, that despite any attempts to forge some kind of foreign policy that is coherent and that targets a specific quote-unquote enemy, that by labeling Russia and China as kind of equal players in the so-called threat category, what the U.S. is admitting is that no longer can it compete and no longer can it allow Russia and China to stand independent, sovereign, and united. But the more that it goes after both of these countries, of course, the more they are going to come together because they share an external enemy now. So this is quite the conundrum. It is one that is not going to go away. It is one that is kind of inevitable at this point because the United States and its NATO allies cannot afford to get close to either Russia and China for both political and economic reasons. And it's so interesting that in this moment when we're talking about the United States as kind of this declining empire, that you have this very clear set of lines being drawn where Russia and China are supposed to be the so-called enemies of the United States, but the only thing that could possibly save the United States from itself in foreign policy terms is by trying to divide the two. So that's why you have competing strategies that really end up coming together and forming one foreign policy objective, and that is the destruction of both. And the fact of the matter is that the United States nor its so-called allies have any capability to do such a thing. China and Russia alone, standing alone, are powerful enough. Russia has shown it in Ukraine. China has shown it with its immense economic growth and its ability to cooperate with damn near everybody in the world. Russia, of course, not so close behind in that realm. These countries alone are able to stand up to the United States and the collective West. Together, they make up a force that is the leading one in multilateral, multipolar developments like BRICS, like SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, like, of course, the Eurasian projects of Belt and Road Initiative, Eurasian Economic Union. All of these projects really flash to us the future of the world order. And the United States and the collective West, by not being able to flexibly maneuver the international arena to meet its own interests, is really admitting and showing the world that, in fact, it really has no other cards to play, that it's either going to pursue this endless war, which could very go nuclear against these two countries, or it is simply going to, grind up into dust and float away in the wind, which is kind of what's happening right now because the United States is finding itself and its NATO allies are finding themselves on the outside looking in on all of these multipolar developments. And that is only going to make it more and more belligerent. So the writing is on the wall, and that is very clear to see when it comes to how the U.S. approaches Russia and China.
But there's none so blind as those that will not see. Danny Haiphong, who can see very clearly. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. How's the poll going? Should child murderers face the death penalty? Almost 20,000 people have voted, and pretty convincingly, people say yes. Let me take a quick break, and then it's your calls right up to the hour. On the line is a Rose in Texas. How's that at the beginning of a song? On Californication, which is a song. Rose, welcome to the show.
Fan of the show, transgender fan of the show, and I wanted to briefly address your monologue from last week on Californication, because I almost entirely agree with what you said. Trans women athletes taking medals and records, directing children at nightclubs and even going to elementary schools themselves, not to mention hormone blockers for children as well. The attack on freedom of speech, not only against conservatives, but anyone who doesn't fall in line with the agenda, rainbow flags on NATO military aircraft, which is certainly doing more to cultivate anti-queer sentiment around the world than there already is. All of that makes me sick. So because I don't believe in incest, bestiality, necrophilia, and pedophilia, I'm basically culturally right-wing by today's standards, even though less than 5 years ago, I'd still be left-wing. So in regards to you and everyone else watching who thinks of me and people like me as the villains right now, you should know that I support the most traditional Muslim, Jewish, Abrahamic believers to be as homophobic and transphobic as they want, because guess what? That's freedom of religion, which is a value we claim to have in the West. Now, my religion, I suppose, is I believe I'm a woman, but guess what? Not everyone has to convert to my religion. Otherwise, we basically have a theocracy, only this theocracy is for the ever-evolving LGBTQIA supercalifragilisticexpialidocious club. So that's all I wanted to get out of my system. Thank you.
Well, Rose, if I could put your call in a glass bottle and ship it around the world, I promise you that I would do so. Crystal clear beautifully expressed, and I wish you every happiness in life. It is exactly what people who are transgender should be saying. And if they were, they would disappoint the liberal zealots who want to use them as a battering ram against the traditional family values of the rest of us. Beautifully expressed, Rose. I'll never forget it.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Here's some emails. This one from Tony. By the way, our email address is onair@moats.tv. George, NATO are softening up their populations for the defeat of Ukraine. It's clear the propaganda networks are suddenly telling the truth to a degree. The so-called Ukrainian counter-offensive is a total disaster. Nobody can deny this fact. Right, the killer nurse, Neil, is on the phone from Epping. I think Broadmoor's quite near there. Let's hear from Neil on the killer nurse. Go ahead, Neil.
Right. My second call to you, George. You'll have to bear with me. I have a terminal illness and I'm on oxygen, so I'll have to pause between sentences.
Okay.
But this is going to happen
take
again.
Your time, brother.
This is going to happen again and again and again. There's no staff in NHS hospitals. There's a culture of bullying. Okay. Now, Stephen Bolson was a personal friend of mine who pointed out the deaths of babies in Bristol. He was hounded out. Okay. He couldn't get a job in England. He had to go. He became professor of pediatric anesthesiology in Australia. Now, you won't stop anything like this happening. You can stick a naught over what people like Beverly Allett have done and what Shipman have done. Shipman was only found out because one of his victims' daughters was a lawyer, and she noticed that her mother's daughter had been the signature was forged on her will. There's a culture of bullying. There's no staff. I tipped up a colleague in, and you can check this out in The Guardian, which used to be a newspaper. It's now a horrible rag. But in Hancock's constituency, at the West Suffolk Hospital, if you check out the deaths of Horace Nunn and Sue Warby, and Sue Warby's death was only found out because her husband was an ex-DCI. And the whistleblowers were tracked down, and there was a witch hunt. They wanted us to give handwriting tests to find out who'd been tipping off patients. Okay. I had a colleague that went to work at the West Suffolk Hospital, and he phoned me up and he said, I didn't believe it was going on. But he said, you haven't. If anything, you've understated the case. So he went to work abroad. But there's no staff. There's a culture of bullying. And honestly, George, the next one will happen.
It's quite horrifying. Yeah, it's quite horrifying. I think we're going to have to dive deeper into it. Didn't have time to get a guest on it today. But when you use the phrase, you can stick a knot on all these numbers, I absolutely agree with you. You can stick a knot on the number of people that have been killed in this way. And there are so many that we don't even know about, don't even yet suspect. It is truly horrifying, nightmarish stuff. Neil in Epping, many thanks for your call. Joseph in London on the wretched PeterWilby. Go ahead, Joseph.
Hello, George. I just want to say I 110% support what you said about PeterWilby. The PeterWilby case is part of something much deeper on the left. Now, I am a leftist, a socialist, and I'm not going to name any living person, so you don't need to worry about libel, but I can tell you PeterWilby is just part of a general trend on the left, which is to be ultra-liberal and to support, actually, to be very soft on the issue of child abuse. The examples I would give is organisations which I've known, which have advocated ending the age of consent for children. So the age of consent is oppressive, it stops children. I mean, are these people mad? I mean, they say they're in favour of socialism.
There's a fine line as to whether or not they're mad. But I'm going to name somebody who's still alive, Peter Tatchell, who's still on the mainstream media as some kind of respectable commentator. I saw him on television, his lips moving, as he shilled for the idea that 40-year-old men having sex with children was not necessarily a bad or evil thing. That many of his friends had spoken to survivors of this who claimed that it hadn't done them any harm. Well, I speak as someone to whom it did a considerable amount of harm. And I agree with you. When you embark down the yellow brick road of liberalism, where does it end up? It ends up on PeterWilby's computer. It ends up there. If you tear up everything that was once sacred, abandon all collective morality, embark on this madness of individualism where everyone can do exactly as they please and can please themselves irrespective of the harm that it does to other people. Indeed, elevate that to the status of a kind of ideology, then it ends up, the yellow brick road ends up in Pete Wilby's study on his computer watching toddlers being raped at the same time as lecturing everyone else into how they should live their lives. Last word to you, Joseph.
Yeah, I mean, the latest thing which they're doing now is that the sort of liberals are promoting this idea of childhood sexuality. They don't say we're in favour of abuse because they know they can't get away with that so easily these days. They say, we want to explore childhood sexuality. What the hell is that? There's no such thing.
Minor attracted persons.
Sort of thing.
They don't talk about paedophiles. Minor attracted persons.
This is
bringing children in front of drag shows and men waving their dicks in G-strings at small children at public expense in public facilities. This madness has been allowed to go on and on and on.
I know what it is you get paedophiles who join these groups and they use it as cover for their activities. They hope they'll get support if they get found out and things, and they get a lot of naive idiots involved who've never experienced abuse themselves and don't know how these things work, and they get these naive idiots to be their gang, and then they just it just gives them a hiding place, and we've got to get that away from the left. I'm not a social conservative in that sense. I fully support equality for women. I don't want to see gay people or transgender people persecuted. I'd hate to see anything like that. But we need to go back to sort of sensible politics on the left and get these exploiters out.
Sensible politics. Yeah. Common sense socialism. That's what I stand for. Joseph, thank you for that call. An email from Paul who says, a hospital is not run by one nurse. Should hospital managers who sat and counted their salaries into the bank in the face of a rising toll of unexplained baby deaths face a suitable penalty? Paul Brown, in Sheffield. Well said, Paul. Simon's on the line. He's an expert. He's a legend He's in Florida. Go ahead, Simon.
Thank you so much, Mr. Galloway. Two rather complicated issues that I'll try and make as understandable as possible. We're now in a situation where we have a constitutional crisis in Pakistan. You recall from one of your previous guests, they jammed through amendments to both the Army Act and the Official Secrets Act a couple of weeks ago. And those went to the desk of the Pakistan president, who, in a kind of similar role to the Queen or the President of the United States, would have to give his assent to those documents in order for them to become official law. Now, the President of Pakistan, who had vociferously disagreed with those sweeping legal changes being brought in overnight in a barely attended parliament in its very few final days before being dissolved, did not give his written assent that he would have needed to do so in order for them to become law. This is all the procedures laid out by Article 75 of the Pakistan Constitution. What he in fact told his staff to do was the other part of the requirement, which was to send the bills back to the Parliament in order to be reconsidered, in much the same way the British House of Lords can send something back. Then, similarly to the British Parliament Act, if they approve it again and resend it to him, then he either is forced to sign it, or by doing nothing, it will default into law. Now, he's come out on Twitter saying that he told his staff to send the bills back with his comments, which would have triggered the procedure. However, much like Blackadder, he had a cunning scheme. And the cunning scheme was to wait until the Pakistan Parliament had dissolved itself so they wouldn't be able to gather to redo the second vote. However, his cunning scheme was undermined by some of his own personal staff members not actually sending the documents back at all to the Speaker of the Pakistan Parliament. The Pakistan government has taken the view that by doing nothing, they've defaulted into law. But the problem is there's no actual provision as to what should happen in this set of circumstances in the Pakistan constitution. And indeed, the president himself is about to be termed out in just a month. But fortunately, it provides for, in the constitution, for a situation where there's no parliament to reappoint a new president, he'll stay as the acting president until the national elections finally, heaven only knows when, will finally be held in Pakistan. Now, we have a similar situation in Niger with people trying to stand on legal niceties. And when people think about legal niceties, it's worth remembering that Tony Blair's defense secretary during the second invasion of Iraq, Mr. Jeff Hoon, recently admitted that he was told to burn the legal advice that he had received as a British Secretary of State, telling him that it was illegal for Her Majesty's armed forces to participate in the invasion of Iraq. So what lots of people don't know is the African Union, like the United Nations, has a 15-member Security Council. They met a few days ago. The results haven't been published, but it's leaked out that only 4 of the 15 countries were willing to go ahead with the military intervention in Niger. And now that organization has a crisis because they've got a decision against it, but the results are being held secret as foreign powers try and persuade enough of the countries that said no to change their vote so a new decision can be published. And failing that in the next few days, there'll have to be a second meeting of the African Union Security Council, possibly right on the eve of BRICS, when all the African leaders, it has now been announced, are going to have a one-day summit in addition to the BRICS meeting with the President of South Africa, co-hosted by the President of China.
Wow, what an update. Thank you very much indeed, Simon. In Florida, a tour of the troubled horizon in Niger and in Pakistan, and he didn't overstate the crisis in any way, I can assure you. Patreon comments are flooding in. Here are some from my loyal supporters on whom I rely. Thank you, all of you. Stephen Leahy says, the death penalty, if you murder someone, then we're going to murder you. Hypocrisy, surely. And Leslie Hope says, I'm against the death penalty. One of my ancestors, Susanna North Martin, was executed in the Salem witch persecutions. She was convicted on the accusations of children. History has exonerated her of everything she was accused of doing, yet her family was traumatized for several generations. And Hill, H-I-L, says, I can't ever approve of state killing. Being a minority in a racist society will always entail a disproportionate bias against minorities not accessing justice and facing the death penalty because, yes, the system is rigged and racist. And Fra Hughes says the Guildford Four were framed by the police. The judge said his only regret in jailing them was that he could not impose the death penalty. People are victims of miscarriages of justice. If you put the guilty to death, you will ultimately murder the innocents too. Is that a price worth paying? I think not, says Fra. So do support me. Search me up on Patreon, patreon.com/George Galloway. You'll get access to lots of new videos and, of course, a free showing of Killing Kelly, my film, on the strange death of Dr. David Kelly. Coming up after the break, His Excellency Tony Kevin, former Australian ambassador to, amongst other places, Poland. It's 5 o'clock in the morning for the Honourable Tony Kevin, but he's got up to speak to you because there's some very important things he wants to say. So stay tuned. I'll be right back.
You have to remember back in 2002, 2003, there was a wish by George Bush for regime change. That's what was driving him. Nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction, which of course didn't exist in Iraq. So they had to construct some sort of formula, some sort of cover story in order to persuade the British public that intervention in Iraq was right. Now, David Kelly, as an expert in weapons of mass destruction, knew that this was untrue. He knew that there were probably no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
That was a guy that could have brought down, the whole system.
I reckon you're chaff. You've been thrown up to divert our probing.
The Foreign Affairs Select Committee, that parliamentarian briefing, I think that was an indignity to him.
We saw it on the news, and my very first thought was shock. Oh my God, you know, this man is in the eye of the media hurricane. He should be protected by that at least.
You've got blood on your hands, Prime Minister. Are you going to resign over this?
I don't know the details of how Lord Hutton happened to be selected, but what was certainly the case is that he was the right kind of judge to use from the point of view of Downing Street and the intelligence services as well.
Of the 21 days of hearing, only one half of one day was spent on discussing the forensic aspects. That is disgusting.
We were given the Hutton report the day before it was published, but actually what happened was he went too far.
The events of 2003 were disgraceful ones in this country's history, and it's unfinished business. Those responsible for an illegal war, those responsible for the death of David Kelly, have not been brought to justice. There's been no inquest into David Kelly's death. There needs to be one. We need to make sure that those who behaved in a reprehensible way in 2003 are finally brought to book.
Well, I'm very proud of that film, very proud of that cinema poster. So do get it from my shop in DVD or support me on Patreon and watch it thereafter for free. It'll only cost you per week less than the cost of a cup of tea in an insalubrious cafe. That poll is very substantial, showing the level of the revulsion that people feel about child killers. I'm a no voter on that because of the danger of miscarriage of justice. I don't balk at the idea that some people deserve to be executed for their crimes. The problem is the inability to be sure that you are executing the right person. There have been far too many, so many miscarriages of justice here in Britain, and no doubt in other countries too, that you could not safely go down that road. What I do say, I'm sure it will be the case in this particular mass murder, but it isn't in others, is that life imprisonment needs to mean what it says. The idea that someone can be out on the street having murdered someone in a decade or even less, when the family of the murdered have a life sentence for the rest of their lives, is, I think, itself a miscarriage of justice. Selection of YouTube comments. Ezekiel Mavolo says, watching from Liberia, we love you, Gigi. Your legacy of truth will live on forever. Thank you, my dear brother. Paul Metz Cohen says, please investigate what's happening in the NHS, George. I've witnessed some awful things when I used to visit my mother, including cruelty and an uncaring attitude from nurses towards older patients. And Berry says, oh, snap, George looking dapper. Looking like $1 million, all green and crinkly. Gerard Thomas says, George looks like Hercule Poirot about to get on the Orient Express. You say that, Gerard, as if it's a bad thing. A boom? A boom? Oh no, that's Clouseau. BA says, zombie in the air, don't support the death penalty because the justice system isn't perfect. And Vijaya Suryamurthy says, I don't agree with the death penalty because of miscarriages of justice. Negras Tormentas says, no one has the right to decide who lives and who dies. And Uzi says, a big problem with the death penalty is that our justice system isn't competent enough to ensure no false convictions. You can free an innocent person from prison, but not a coffin. So the poll is, on Telegram, 77% say child murderers should face the death penalty. On Twitter, 73%. On the YouTube community poll, 85% say child murderers should face the death penalty. And on the YouTube stream, 73%. More than 20,000 people have voted now. It's officially a very big poll. You've still got time to get your vote in. Make sure you do. Coming up shortly will be the retired Australian ambassador to, amongst other places, Poland. And Poland has become unusually important in this geopolitical picture. I have nothing, far from it, against Polish people. I have known and worked with and served Polish people for a very long time. God-fearing people. My parish church, where I used to live in London, was virtually 100% Polish. The Mass would have been empty without them. Hard-working people, skilled people, benefited from the prioritization of technical education in the socialist period, and had produced whole generations of tradesmen of the very highest rank, knocked ours into a cocked hat by and large. So I have nothing at all against Poland. But I'm not going to let Poland drag me into World War III, are you? And I don't think the Germans, the French, should allow Poland to drag them into World War III. Still more, these yapping Baltic states with tiny populations and a particular animus towards Russia. These people are in real danger of dragging us into World War III. And I personally will not go along with it. What about you? Before we go to His Excellency, let's take a couple of calls. John is in New York on U.S. politics. Let's hear from John. Go ahead, John.
Hi, George. I am a big follower of yours and a supporter financially of yours as much as I can. And yours is one of the true voices that speaks to my heart. So this is not an easy question. I don't even know if you can answer this question. But things are going so badly here, at least in Long Island, where I am, with the price of milk or the price of gas or infrastructure, the roads crumbling, you name it. How are you able to separate the people that are in charge of these policies and having these results with their voters who vote them in election after election after election? Joe Biden has had office for 48 years, and I don't see anything but failure to account for it. How do you separate, again, the politician, the person, from the people that are giving them the power? Because if the leaders are not good, can it be that their voters are also not good?
It's what we used to call, John, when it was worth much more than it is today, the $64,000 question. That undoubtedly, to an extent, we get the government that we deserve. Certainly the government that we vote for. It's very rare, we've got it at the moment, but it's very rare that someone almost bereft of political support, for whom nobody has ever voted, is in power. Rashid Sunak, as Joe Biden memorably called him, was never elected by anybody. There was no election. He just became the prime minister. So, for the most part, you get the government that you vote for. Now, there's no point thereafter in saying, not in my name, because it is being done in your name, on your dime, on your dollar, with your armed forces, under your flag, and through your country at the United Nations, and so on. So it's just escapism to pretend that it's not being done in your name. If you are a citizen of the United States or the United Kingdom or any of these countries conducting crimes abroad, then you share some of the responsibility. How does it happen? Well, partly it's the fault of people like me for having failed to create a political opposition sufficiently attractive to people, to win them from this uniparty, this duopoly, this two cheeks of the same ass that passes for a polity in your country and mine. We must be self-critical about that. How did it come to pass that the only choice that people could be offered was Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Rashid Sunak and somebody you'll never have heard of, a block of wood called Sir Keir Starmer. This is really the two cheeks of the same arse. And so those of us who are opposed to that duopoly have failed until now to create an alternative sufficiently attractive to attract enough people to at least elect a few of us to be there in the Parliament, providing an alternative point of view and opposition. The media has a very large part to play in it. The majority of people in Long Island, where you are not watching this show. They're not even watching Tucker Carlson's alternative take on events. They're watching CNN. They're watching MSNBC. They're reading the New York Times, or even worse than the New York Times. So The media has a large part to play in it. But now, in the age of the internet, it is a choice to be ignorant, you know. The people could find this show. They could find Jimmy Dore. They could, if they let their fingers do the walking, they could find Lee Camp. They could find alternative points of view, but they have chosen not to. And therefore they do, you're right, no point hiding from it, share some of the culpability of driving on crumbling roads, traversing unsafe bridges, running the risk of derailment of trains full of toxic materials outside their front window, sending their children to a substandard school, the risk of crime, taking their loved ones in a shootout in a mall somewhere, or even worse, in a children's school. They share the responsibility for that because they have not chosen to turf out the rancid political class that rules your country and mine. Thanks, John, for a great call. Let's go to Ehab in Michigan on Ukraine. Ehab, welcome to the show. What would you like to say?
Thank you, George. I guess you just said almost everything.
Well, that's all right. Have a go.
All right. So the way I see it, it's like give peace a chance, as the topic of your show is. Hello?
Yeah, go on. We're waiting.
Okay, so the topic of your show is give peace a chance. And I'm thinking, like, given the present circumstances in the world, we all know that peace has long been the side issue for any of these governments. It's all about imposing their hegemony. It's about controlling markets. The other piece that you said, which I 100% agree with, is the control of the media of people's minds. They're more interested, and the media makes them more interested in trivial things than the real, true economic and military things that are going on in the world. Say, for example, how the media is saturated with...
Yeah, with triviality. I mean, I had the misfortune of catching some of Love Island last night. I think I watched it for 10 minutes. And I was sad at the depths to which the young people participating in it allowed themselves. But I was even more sad that many millions of people are going to watch it. And only it and things like it, rather than serious things that would help them change their lives for the better. There's no doubt that we are being let down by our media, and we're being let down by our education system, which prepares our young people for a life of consumption of this television junk food. But we can't absolve the people themselves from the choice, because we all know you're one of them. I'm one of them. Everybody watching this is one of them. We all know so many people who went through exactly the same education system and are exposed to exactly the same mass media, but who have found their way to alternative points of view, alternative channels through which they can learn and also communicate bad. Ehab in Michigan, one of my favorite places. Thank you very much indeed for the call. Now, His Excellency Tony Kevin is on the line, but it is a bad line. But I'm going to go to him in the hope that we can hear each other well enough to make it worthwhile getting up in the middle of the night, as he has done. His Excellency Tony Kevin, former Australian ambassador and, amongst other places, ambassador to Poland. Your Excellency, thank you for joining us, particularly at this unearthly hour. I'm hoping you can hear me clearly, and now I can see you. Thanks very much for joining us. Unfortunately, we can see you but not hear you, Excellency. We'll have to come back to you, and I very much hope that we can and that you haven't risen in the middle of the night for nothing. The poll, I can say 20,461 people have voted, but the balance is not changing. At least 3/4 of you, on average, across the 4 portals, think the death penalty should be reintroduced for child murderers. Here's the numbers again: the UK and Ireland 08081 965522, the US and Canada +1 844 944 3344, and the rest of the world 44 203 966 2625. Some YouTube comments while we try and get the ambassador back. Dennis Revel says the problem with the death penalty is not the penalty itself, but the oftentimes, lack of 100% certainty that the right perpetrator has been identified. And he gives the case of Rutte, a famous case in English legal history. Sean Bebbington says, I'm opposed to capital punishment, not because of this case, but for the case that convicts someone who may be innocent, maybe even framed. And Jenny Lynn says they think her motive had a lot to do with catching the attention of a particular doctor in the unit. That was the most atrocious thing of all, Jenny, when I read it. Let's go back to Ambassador Tony Kevin, see if we can hear him this time. Excellency, thank you for joining us. I have 2 questions for you, Chris. Really. The first one, Chris, is how did Australia become such a slavish ally of the United States that it is prepared to risk war with its biggest trading partner and relatively close neighbor in China? Why did the political class in Australia go tonto in the way that they have? Well, we're going to have to abandon that. We can't keep trying it. So let's get Ambassador Kevin back another time. Concerned Patriot says, what if she is a scapegoat and another more senior individual skillfully did the awful deeds? Only on her shifts, it's horrific either way. Eve is in Idaho, always welcome on the show. Haven't heard from him for a few days. Hope he wasn't offended by my Peter Sellers attempt at a French accent. Eve, welcome.
Hello. Yes, I wanted to make a point on this Ukraine war that I believe was not made. The plan of the Ukrainian was to apparently to go from Zaporozhye towards Crimea. And this looks completely crazy at first because the supply line will have to go from Poland all the way down to Crimea, basically. And so the Russian would have all the opportunity to break this supply line. So I was wondering if the plan was not, in fact, to make a beachhead towards Crimea to have NATO directly on this beachhead to supply the weapon, and the weapon like that would be right at the location of the conflict. Because there have been a lot of Ukrainian comparison with D-Day. And D-Day was something like that. You know, they would go to Normandy and they would supply the American weapon in Normandy against the Germans. So I was wondering if the plan was not actually to build a beachhead on Crimea, to have directly NATO position here and bring all the weapons on that spot. That's what I wanted to say.
Well, that would require, an amphibious assault on Crimea. Who would do that? Who has the capacity to do that under Russian fire?
The Ukrainian, they wanted the Ukrainian to make a blitzkrieg towards Crimea, secure a little a beachhead there, and then once they get that, to do the supply line from this spot, you see, because otherwise it's insane. You see, it's insane to have such a long, how can they go so deep, bringing the tank and all that? It's impossible. And I think that's why they was always referring to the Ukrainian D-Day and things like that. That's just it's just a supposition. But
look, it's possible, Yves. But I've detected it long, but I detect it more and more clearly now that NATO has no intention of getting involved in this war, that they have blinked, and that they are recklessly pumping more and more escalatory weapons into the conflict, but that they will not risk their own armed forces. They will not risk even the best versions of their own weapons. The Abrams, for example, or the Chieftain tank is not to be used at the front line, to be used in safe areas. The Abrams has been armored. Its armor has been weakened because of the fear of its actual armor in US hands falling into the hands of the Russians. So they're recklessly supplying more and more weapons, but a cheaper version, if you like, a less efficient version of them. They basically are playing for time now. It's like a footballer carrying the ball down to the corner flag. That's what it looks like to me, hoping to run the clock down in the hope that, something might turn up, something might rescue them from this debacle into which they have been plunged. Yves, thanks very much for the call. I'm unable to see who else is on the line because my computer has gone off. So I'm leaving it to my director to tell me it's Jamie in Malaga in my ear. Go ahead, Jamie. Welcome.
Good evening, George. Thanks so much for all the brilliant work you're doing and taking my call again.
Thank you.
Tonight, I want to do a call out to supporters of Julian Assange for the worldwide Australian Embassy Day that we have planned for Saturday, the 2nd of September, which is the day before Father's Day in Australia. And we're really calling on all Assange supporters from around the world to gather outside major Australian buildings, Australian embassies, consulates, or if they can't find an Australian building, then just in a town square, in support for Australia, and to shine light on the fact that either the weakest point or the strongest point in this case is now Australia. In effect, that if the 83% of Australian population who want Julian Assange to be freed can increase the pressure on their Prime Minister Albanese to demand that the American administration, Joe Biden, drop the charges against Julian Assange, we feel that he will be freed. So that's my reason for calling.
Give me the date. Give me the date again, Jamie. We'll put it in our diaries, and everyone should.
Thanks very much. It's actually on Saturday, the 2nd of September, which is in 2 weeks' time.
Okay.
And it's from 12 o'clock until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And we're asking people as well to take photographs of themselves so that we can share them using, if they send photographs to Candles for Assange, they will collect the photographs. They have contacts all around the world with all different Julian Assange supporters, and we want to use this on social media to raise attention to what is going on, and that Julian Assange must be freed.
We'll do, and we'll not just shout it out tonight, but in subsequent shows to make sure that people have got that message. Jamie, thank you very much indeed. Let me have a quick break while we attend to some technical difficulties. Be right back. Do you know how many people watch MSNBC? If this was a normal business, it would be out of business long ago. Do you know how many people watch CNN? We are in danger of fixating too much on the liberal hegemony of media outlets with infinitesimally small viewership. This show that you are watching has 10 times the viewership, 10 times the viewership of Rupert Murdoch's Talk TV with its budget of billions. So, let's not lose hope. Let's be our own media. You're right, not everybody watches me, watches those other people that you watch. Well, it's your job, and it's everybody else's job that's watching this and agrees with me this evening. It's your job to tell as many other people as you possibly can what we are all about, how to find us, encourage them, and check up afterwards whether they took your advice, and if they didn't, encourage them all over again. Have you any idea how we would multiply if everybody watching this did that? The best part of 2 million people will watch this program over the next 7 days. If those nearly 2 million spoke to one other person, we'd be 3 million if their advice was taken. And so on, and exponentially on, it is possible to go. It's in our hands. Let's do it. I can't do much more than what I'm doing. I need you, the audience, to spread the word.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Well, we lost our second guest, as you'll have seen. It's a long way down under. It's also the middle of the night, but the technical difficulties were insurmountable. We'll try and get him back for a subsequent show. That means, though, that the rest of the show is yours. So get calling. We've got 2 lines open, and let's see who makes it. John in South London, he's up first. Go ahead, John.
Hi there. Yeah, I just wanted to raise the issue of actually the democracy that we even live in, because there's no primaries in the UK. I've never really heard anybody talking about this. Don't you think this is something that really needs to be pushed? Obviously, America has it. The UK doesn't. This, to me, seems like the bedrock issue that we've got. There's no primaries. If we had primaries, open primaries, you'd be able to run as Labour against these clowns, and you'd win.
Well, I long advocated that when I was in the Labour Party. I was in the Labour Party for 36 years, but I've now been out of it for 20 years. So that tells you how old I am and what age I was when I joined. But I always advocated it, as a means of mandatory reselection. We had to fight so hard to be allowed to vote on who should be the Labour candidate in an election. And that was just the members voting. But I argued, why don't we let the public choose who should be the Labour candidate in an election, just like they do in the United States. Even the president has to win the primary before he can be the party's candidate in the upcoming election. So I do believe you're onto something, but of course the political parties will never agree to it. And so in a way it's pie in the sky. We'll have to find another way. And that means vote. You see, you say I would win it, John. Well, why wouldn't I win it if I stood as an independent? Why wouldn't I win it if I stood for my own party, the Workers' Party? Why do I have to be the Labour candidate to win it? What's so good about Labour? As a matter of fact, Labour, to me, is so utterly toxic now. I'm ashamed that I tried so hard to stay in it when they were expelling me 20 years ago. And the money I spent on lawyers and so on, trying to stay in it. And the fight I put up, I don't know why now, because once Tony Blair drowned Iraq in blood and drowned the British political system, choked it out of any credibility that it once had, there was no longer any point in being in the Labour Party. And if that were true then, it's certainly true under Keir Starmer. Last word to you, John.
Third parties can't win. That's the uncomfortable reality that I've realised, that is no one's really... Third parties can't win because people don't want to split the vote. We need to get numbers in the streets, get out there and say, we want a primary now. That's it. There's no negotiating. Because third parties can't win.
Well,
RFK recently...
Starmer is literally rigging Labour selections. He's removing, look at the mayor in the northeast of England, an exemplary fellow, hugely popular. The elected mayor wasn't allowed on the ballot to be the Labour candidate in the upcoming election. These party leaders just do what they want. Who can stop them?
We have to pressure them.
Keir Starmer cannot be pressured. That is pie in the sky. John, thanks for the call, though. Look, we've got a good signal. Tony Kevin, Ambassador Kevin, is on the line. Hallelujah. Let's go to him now.
Good.
Ambassador,
Good
thank
morning,
you
George.
for that. Now everything is very clear. Good morning to you. Given the hour, I'll press on quickly, Excellency. There was two things I wanted to ask you, although one additional PS. Let me deal with the first one. Australia, how did it become such a slavish servant of the United States government, thousands and thousands of miles away, that it is prepared to risk war with its major trading partner and relatively near neighbor, China? How did that happen? When did it happen?
George, many books will be written about this. It's partly history and it's partly bad luck. The history is that since World War II, Australia has been dazzled by American power and American glamour. An American official who's unnamed said Australia's an easy lay. And I think that's a 5-word answer to your question. We're an easy lay, as Americans see us.
Well,
we want to be like
yeah,
them.
It's a depressing enough answer. It was bad enough when you were an easy lay for us in Blighty, but to be an easy lay for Joe Biden is a recipe for dissatisfaction, if ever I heard one. but the slavishness is so against your own interest. I mean, if I was China, I'll tell you frankly, if I was the leader of China, I wouldn't buy another thing that is grown in or made by an Australian hand. I'd actually say, go to hell, Australia. Instead, they buy huge amounts of your exports.
This is all true, but we have been deeply penetrated politically, economically, culturally, psychologically by America over the last 20 or 30 years. We had a brief window of independence, of sovereignty, from the time Gough Whitlam came to power to the time Paul Keating lost power to John Howard. In those 20 years, we were actually finding our home in Asia and establishing an identity for ourselves, a very attractive multicultural identity. But now we have timorously and timidly gone back into the American lager. And we don't need regime change in Australia. We're already deeply penetrated. And I have to emphasise this. I think much is the same is true of England, I would dare to say, and also of Germany. So we have all gone back to lackey status, to this strange globalist imperialist regime in Washington that doesn't seem to care that America is falling apart around it. They're in their gated suburbs. They live very well, this little 1%. They want to rule the world, and Australia is just coming along, wagging its tail and saying, please, pat me on the head. What do you want me to do next? And that's where we are, unfortunately.
The other issue I wanted to talk to you about was Poland, because of your expertise in relation to that. As I was saying earlier, I have the reverse of animus towards Polish people. But I'm damn sure I'm not going to allow them to drag me into World War III. And there's a growing feeling, in France especially, but also in Germany and to some extent in the UK, that countries like Poland, Romania another one, and these yapping Baltic states are driving the policy towards the Ukraine war, dragging Europe and NATO into cataclysmic war. Do you share that apprehension? And is there anyone in Poland, is there any force in Poland that is equally apprehensive about it?
I'm not quite as apprehensive as you are at this moment. I do think, although there is a fanatical Russophobia in Poland, and always has been, there's also an element of rationality. And when the Poles look and see how Ukraine has been destroyed by this war, I'm fairly confident in their ultimate common sense that they won't let the same thing happen to them, because they must know that the same facts of economics and geography and demographics apply to them in relation to Russia as applied to Ukraine. America had 8 years to prepare Ukraine for war against Russia. America wanted Ukraine to go to war against Russia. They thought that Ukraine could win and establish some sort of dynamic towards regime change in Russia. They were wrong on every count. So why should they try it again with Poland? I think there's enough rationality in Washington and Warsaw for this not to happen. And I think that the Ukrainian war will now drive itself to its tragic conclusion, and it really is a tragic conclusion. A fine country has been destroyed by their own fault and by the Americans' fault in abusing them against Russia. And this is criminal behavior. And I want to make a point here, George. It's a very important point. The Americans, I mean the globalist power elite in Washington, now see this war as a win-win for them, because whatever they lose, and they don't lose anything. Their military-industrial complex just makes newer and better weapons. The Ukrainians lose 500,000 people, 500,000 men. For the Americans of this particular frame of mind, it's win-win, because a dead Ukrainian is almost as good as a dead Russian, because if the Russians are going to take control of Ukraine anyway, the weaker you make Ukraine demographically and in terms of infrastructure, the less you're giving Russia at the end of the day. So there we go. Heads we win, tails you lose. I'm sure this is the way Biden looks at it, and it's a horrible, evil way to look at it, but I believe this is the case.
Now, finally, I may say this has been a late interview and will therefore have to be a shorter one, but I'm mightily impressed by the quality of it, so we'll definitely ask you back. But briefly, if you will, given the hour, I wanted to ask you about, if you like, a broader question. Notice that we both approved of a statement that we saw on social media today, which, to paraphrase, said, you hate Russia because Russia is what you used to be, at least what you wanted to be, a cohesive society, a society where family values, where patriotic feeling, where a lack of wokeness, if you like, to cut to the chase, a socially conservative country, which actually most people in most countries want to be in. I'm talking to you tonight from Serbia. I'm moving on tomorrow, but here in Serbia, the same is true. And the people here feel that they are disliked by the globalists and their power centers because, like Russia, they are a country like we used to be. If I'm right in saying that you and I both kind of endorse that perspective, please say why.
I'm glad to, and if you can give me a little time, I'll expand on this. I know Russia pretty well, and apart from my family connections in Australia, which of course are vital to me, my family ultimately is what counts for me, I feel more at home in Russia than I do in Australia at this moment. And that's a dreadful thing to admit. I find myself going back to English literature, back to 19th century Trollope. I'm really enjoying the Palliser novels at the moment. But even more recent English literature, the literature of the 1930s, Graham Greene, Aldous Huxley, Evelyn Waugh, I feel at home there, precisely because of what you say. We were a society that had some pretty clear moral values, some pretty clear integrity. We're lost in confusion now, and Russia is standing for those things that we used to stand for, and I'm very proud to say that. My book, Return to Moscow, which I wrote in 2016, 2 years after Maidan, I didn't realize then what was coming, but in a kind of a way, I predicted all of this. It's a book that, reading it 6 or 7 years later now, and it's still available, really tells us something about the Russians. They're a good people. They're a noble people. They're an intelligent people. They're a courageous people. And we used to be all those things. But we've got lost, George, and I just hope we can find ourselves again.
Amen to that. Book that man, please, Chris, for the nearest available show. You're a terrific guest. I'm only sorry that we had these difficulties and therefore are short of time now. Thank you, Ambassador Tony Kenny, for coming on the show. Thank you. We've got time only for a couple of calls then. So Rex is in Seattle on the US and Ukraine. Let's hear from him. Rex, welcome.
Thank you, George. Okay.
Yeah, go on.
So
Yeah. So, I was wondering on what you think the chances are for, a viable debate between Biden and RFK Jr. And also, he's kind of like the wild card, maybe like a American like Prometheus for the Democratic Party, since it's so kind of cringe right now. At least in my opinion.
It's a very good question. Yeah, go ahead.
And I think like the state of the country is so kind of deranged right now, where I don't think any real war would be in the country's interest. How kind of disorganized things are in this country, like I don't know.
Well, of course, a war is not in the country's interest. Though there was a poll yesterday that showed 2/3 of Americans think the U.S. should be doing more in its preparation for possible war with China. So the popularity of the Ukraine war against Russia is falling sharply, but 2/3 of Americans want to tool up to get ready for a war with China. What is wrong with us? I say us because we are two countries divided by a common language, sure, but the one language we have in common is an apparent lust for conflict and war. Rex, thanks for the call. Melvin, always worthwhile, is in New York. Let's hear from him. Melvin, go ahead.
Hello, George. Nice to speak to you again. You hear me quite well?
And you. Very well, very clear.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm going to make this short but sweet. So a few weeks ago, the United States Congress, all but 12 Democrats, or not Democrats, Republicans, 12 Republicans voted the Constitution of the United States down, okay? So this shows me that anything that we believed in the United States as Americans doesn't ring true to anything, as far as our elections, if they can vote down the Constitution of the United States. We have, as far as Ukraine goes, there is a document that you can look up on Google. It's declassified. It's from the CIA. It dates all the way back to the 60s, called Operation Aerodynamic. I suggest if anybody wants to know where this really all is going and where it's all started, read it. I have. On top of all of that, and I'll leave it with this, the only thing I see for the United States where we might actually be able to stop World War III, or at least us getting into it, is what's called It's a Convention of States, where anybody can sign up and petition it. It is the only thing I found that might oversee or overstep our politicians.
Well,
what's
I
your
hope so.
opinions?
I very much hope so, because the presidential election doesn't look like it's going to be any kind of opportunity to stop this headlong careering into oblivion. The last caller asked me if Biden will debate RFK. Of course he won't, because Joe Biden would be immediately revealed to be a blithering idiot, not fit to be sent out to buy a loaf. So he cannot. But that won't make any difference. The majority of Democrats will pick him, according to the poll. And they look like they're going to put Donald Trump in prison if they don't terminate him with extreme prejudice. But even if they don't, they seem to have the capacity to rig the next presidential election as they rigged the last one. So if elections can't fix it, what can? Well, you've come up with one creative suggestion. Perhaps we need to look more deeply into that. Email from Ben. Dear George, no question from me tonight. Just want to say it looks like you've lost weight and the new suit is cracking. Kind regards, Ben. Thank you, Ben, for that. Kevwe Abenabe says, Tony Kevin, such a gentleman. George knows how to pick his guests. Well, you know what, Kevwe, sometimes you immediately click with someone, and I feel I immediately clicked with Tony. I didn't expect to. I had no expectation at all, but we'll definitely get him back. I think he's going to be very good value indeed. The poll closed at 21,267 people, overwhelmingly voting to return the death penalty for child murderers. Last call then, Josh in Phoenix, Arizona. How could I resist it? Not Jojo, but Josh in Phoenix, Arizona. Loves the show, has something to say. Go ahead, Josh.
George, thank you for being yourself.
Yes, go ahead.
Much appreciated. I place you there with Tommy from your diplomatic wing from the show.
Tommy, we haven't heard from Tommy for weeks. I wonder where he is. Tommy in Glasgow, call home. He was the diplomatic wing. Yeah, you're right. Now tell me this: what Phoenix, Arizona? I was mixing it up with Tucson, Arizona, but Phoenix is such a magical name and such a magical image. What's the political situation on the ground in Phoenix, Arizona? Is that Joe Biden country?
Yes and no. Depends on where you're at. I work out in the suburbs of Phoenix. I live in Phoenix, but I work in the suburbs. I'll say you've got your neocons and then you've got your neoliberals. That's pretty much
so kind of 50-50. The sort of place where the ballot box might get stuffed at 4 o'clock in the morning when the lights suddenly go out. That sort of place.
Yeah. It depends on who's there, the governor or the mayor. Who knows? Depends
on who's ahead. I love you, John. Thanks for the call. Sorry that it has to be a very short one because of the technical difficulties we had getting Tony Kevin on the line. Everything is thrown out, and we are now fast running out of time. And if I go over the hour, I've got to pay everybody out of my own pocket for extra time, and it makes the whole thing uneconomic if you get my drift. We can barely bring you this show as it is. So please forgive me if I draw the show to a close now, but say that I think we were treated to two good guests and many good calls, and I hope a decent monologue which managed to convey just how strongly, how fearfully I am approaching this current situation. When I saw little Zelensky playing Top Guns with Rutte, the Rutte in the Netherlands, climbing into the cockpit of an F-16. The Netherlands, which entered recession this week, together with Germany already in recession, Britain desperately, frantically scrambling to stay out of recession, handing over its multi-billion-dollar fleet of F-16s to little Zelensky, the showman, the former porn actor and dancer. It's a grim situation that our leaders are so reckless, and it's abundantly clear to me that these leaders cannot have watched Oppenheimer. I close as I began with a plea to you to see Oppenheimer and encourage everyone to see Oppenheimer. It doesn't matter if you like Oppenheimer or don't like him. If you agree with why he did what he did, or if he even did what he did. That's not important. What is important is that the film manages to convey the sheer, unadulterated horror of the atomic bomb, now of course long left behind by the hydrogen bomb and the thermonuclear hydrogen bombs that we have today, which, as I said, are 1,000 times more deadly. Russia has one missile, which is a multi-warhead missile. It's been dubbed in the Daily Mail Satan. I don't know what its Russian name is. But if Satan were to be launched from Kaliningrad, where it probably would be launched, within 8 minutes, that missile and its multiple warheads would be over at exactly the same moment. The cities of London, Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow, and would literally incinerate everyone and everything in those cities and in all of the lands in between, who would be destroyed in the white hot heat of the blast, and if not so destroyed, would perish in the nuclear winter lasting 1,000 years that would follow the blast. Better by far to be in the epicenter of the blast than to die the death that would await those who survived that blast. And don't think you can save yourself under the stairs or under the kitchen table. Don't think even in a bunker you will be safe, neither from the blast and certainly not from the radiation that would kill you with a sickness almost unimaginable to bear, and to watch your children die from that same sickness if they were to survive somehow a blast from one rocket that took 8 minutes to arrive and is traveling hypersonically and therefore cannot be intercepted, cannot be stopped. So it's a serious business. No one who leaves the cinema, especially if, like me, you were lucky enough to watch it on IMAX, nobody leaves the cinema laughing or even talking. We walked home in virtual silence from Oppenheimer. And Cillian Murphy is absolutely superb. You think he was great in Peaky Blinders? Wait till you see him as Oppenheimer. Thanks very much. I've done it. I've gone over the hour. I've just cost myself extra money, but I thought it was worth it to make the points I now have. Thank you for joining us. I hope to see you again on Wednesday at the slightly later time of 9 p.m. UK time for the midweek edition of the Mother of All Talk Shows. Please bring somebody else with you, by which I mean tell somebody else about this show and why they have to watch it. Good night.